Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor here at Lincoln Square. And joining me today is attorney Spencer Kuvin, and he is the chief legal officer at Gold Law in West Palm Beach. He has represented at least 9 victims of Jeffrey Epstein since 2007. And among them was the first woman who reported Epstein to the police, as well as 3 underage girls in the original Florida case. He's been an outspoken critic of prosecutors for minimizing victims' voices and granting Epstein a secret non-prosecution deal. And he has consistently pushed for the unsealing of key evidence to expose the full extent of Epstein's network. Thank you so much for being here, Spencer.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I just wanted to start with the fact that you actually represented the first Epstein survivor who went to the police. So what did you witness in those early years that showed you just how deeply the system was stacked against victims?
Yeah, and I think that is really an important issue that people need to really fully understand, is that a lot of times victims don't come forward because of how the system is rigged kind of against them. The disbelief, the questioning, the finger pointing at them as to victim blaming and victim shaming really is sadly a part of the system that the police officers and initial investigators that have that initial contact with victims don't have. They don't have that correct training to really understand how they should be treating victims. So in our case, we had a 15-year-old young girl who at the time she finally came forward was 16, but had been victimized starting at age 15. And her parents brought her forward to the police department. And it was after that initial interview with police that they sought out counsel with my firm because of, I think, their frustration with the initial interviews that were taking place with police. You have to also put it in time frame because this was all pre-Me Too.
Right.
This was in a day and age where a young girl coming forward from high school saying that a rich, powerful, wealthy man on Palm Beach Island was doing these awful things. The police looked at her in disbelief and really thought she was making up stories. And that was the initial reaction. So when the parents saw that initial reaction from police and got that initial reaction, it was really disheartening.
Yeah. Do you think that things have changed to some degree? Do police have more training now, or do we still have a ways to go?
Yeah, we have a ways to go, unfortunately. You know, I've consistently represented victims of sexual trauma like this and sexual abuse by powerful people, men and women, over the last 20 years. And what I have seen is a progression of education by the initial investigating officers and a better understanding of what sexual abuse and sexual trauma can do to an individual. But it is not quite there yet. Even up until, just last month, walking a 15-year-old young girl through interviews with FBI agents, it's difficult. It is very difficult. And it's difficult for the adults, the parents of these kids. So you can only imagine how traumatizing and difficult it would be for a child, 15 or 16 years old. But there is a better understanding of how to deal with it. I just think that it's going to be a constant improvement until hopefully we get to a point where victims feel comfortable coming forward to identify their abusers.
Could you talk with us a little bit more about some of the other survivors that you represent and how they decided to come forward?
Sure. So the victims range in categories, and I've always kind of given these categories to police when discussing the victims, specifically of Jeffrey Epstein. There were a category of victims that were single event victims. These were young girls, children that would go to the home, something would happen, inappropriate sexually, and they would never go back again. They were disgusted by it, never go back again, and generally wouldn't talk about it. Then there was a second category. Those were what I called true recruiters. or co-conspirators. Those included people like Ghislaine Maxwell, Sarah Kellen here in Palm Beach, Nadia Marcinkova. Those were individuals that were named in all of our lawsuits that we had sued as what we called true recruiters. These are girls and women that were usually in their 20s to 25-year age range, and they were recruiting other younger girls to come to the house for this conduct. Those were not victims at all in our minds as lawyers representing the victims. There was then this third category that was kind of a gray area. They were girls that were victimized the first time they went to the house, but then chose instead to recruit other girls to bring to the house instead of having to do these acts themselves. And they would get paid to do that. Now, some would say that they're just as guilty as the co-conspirators. But if you actually look at their ages and what they were being groomed to do, it's unfortunate, but I think that some of those young women, girls, were also victims of an abuser who was grooming them to do inappropriate things, which included recruiting other girls, unfortunately, and victimizing these other girls. So those were the different categories we were dealing with.
Is that fairly common in sex trafficking, that girls are then recruited to recruit other girls?
Unfortunately, it is. You see it in large sex trafficking rings, whether it be through the mafia or individual pimps who are trafficking women. They utilize the women and girls that they have to then bring other girls into the fold. Because
they can build some trust.
Exactly, okay. Right? I mean, think about it this way. If you are a young 15-year-old girl and a 54-year-old man comes up to you and asks you to go to his house to do these things, you're going to be revolted and you're going to immediately turn around and walk away. But now switch that. And it's an attractive older woman with a British accent who is highly educated, who says, "You're a beautiful young girl. You're gorgeous. You could be a model. I work with a man who has the ear of the head of Victoria's Secret. We want you to come over to the house and model for us so that we can get you a job and make you a model because you're so beautiful." Now that 15-year-old girl, her defenses are down. Right? She's not thinking that there's some kind of a weird pervert molester old man. She's thinking, I'm beautiful, and this woman thinks I'm beautiful. This is a great opportunity for me, and she goes. That's how you utilize other women like Epstein did to be able to recruit these young girls. I've always said throughout this process in the last 10 years, there would have never been a Jeffrey Epstein without a Ghislaine Maxwell.
Yeah, can we talk a little bit more about her role? Because obviously now, through her lawyers, she has been trying to portray herself as a victim, but several of the Epstein survivors have described her as a monster and actually worse than Jeffrey Epstein. How do you see her role in everything?
I do. I agree with the victims in that regard. I think she is worse because she was a facilitator. She facilitated the growth of Jeffrey Epstein as an icon in the financial world and in the world of interviewing or introducing him to famous people and other people that were within her orbit, including royalty. And it gave him this level of importance in the world that he wouldn't have had without her. And then she's helping to recruit these victims. And she's actively out bringing victims to Jeffrey Epstein. She's bringing these victims to the sacrifice. And again, without her, Epstein likely would never have engaged in the volume of abuse that he did. So, is there a Jeffrey Epstein without Ghislaine Maxwell? I certainly don't think it would have been as prevalent as it ended up becoming. So yes, and there are victims, including one I represented, that was willing to testify and that did file a complaint based upon the sexual abuse directly by Ghislaine Maxwell. This is a woman that deserves to be behind bars for the rest of her life.
The world that Epstein and Maxwell traveled in is a foreign one for most of us. I mean, they were uh, consorting with billionaires and royalty, and um, there's a stereotype in America that folks of that stature are above the law. How much of this case, unfortunately, has proved that maxim? Because you've said that prosecutors in Florida sabotaged the case by slut shaming and intimidating teenage survivors. Um, we've yet to see full justice for this case. So, what kind of message, has this case sent to the public?
Yeah, unfortunately, the wrong message. But here's the reality. Within a few months of us dealing with the non-prosecution agreement that the secret agreement, the sweetheart deal that Alex Costa entered into with Jeffrey Epstein and his legal team, within a few months of that, there was an arrest that was made in a rural area of Palm Beach County of a Haitian African-American man who was in his 30s that had a inappropriate sexual relationship with one 16-year-old girl. One. He was sentenced to 30 years behind bars. Okay? He had a public defender. 30 years, one victim. We know, and it's now a public record, but we've known this for years as attorneys on behalf of the victims, that the FBI had an indictment ready to go with over 40 victims. 40. And Epstein crossing state lines with numerous of these victims, and in some cases crossing country borders. And he got a deal that not only allowed him to go to his offices during the day and basically just sleep at jail during the night, but it was for less than a year, and he didn't have to leave the county. And it was a plea to soliciting prostitution, which basically said that these young girls were prostitutes. So in his plea, he was allowed to blame the girls again. So when you say that there is no justice for rich, I would say rich and powerful, I would say there's two justice systems that exist in this country, and unfortunately always have. There is a justice system for the poor and the regular Americans, and there is a justice system for the wealthy and influential. And it's just a sad factor of the way our justice system is set up, that if you have money, then you're treated differently.
And Acosta went on to serve in Trump's cabinet during his first term, but we have not had a lot of, he has not really been in the spotlight and since then. Yes. What do we know about where he is? And because his handling of that case has been so widely criticized.
Yeah, I know he sits on the board of Newsmax currently. So after he left the Trump administration, at some point he was hired on to be on the board of Newsmax. And he has avoided the public eye as best he can and avoided interviews as best he can, because he should be embarrassed at the deal he entered into. He should be disgraced for what he did. And the only thing that the victims want to know, and the attorneys for the victims like myself want to know, is why. You know, the biggest question we all have is, why did you enter into such an awful, awful deal?
And now we have Ghislaine Maxwell, who is at Fort Bryan, a minimum security prison in Texas. She was moved there after meeting with the Assistant Attorney General in the Trump administration. Do you believe that she will possibly be pardoned by the president here?
I seriously hope not. I seriously hope not. And I think that if it ends up to where she is ultimately pardoned by the president, it won't be until the end of his 4 years, at which point, if he's going to pardon her, it'll be at that time. Because my guess is that if a deal was struck for that interview that she gave, They probably said that if you keep certain people out of any public statements,
Mhm.
that at the end of the 4 years, we can't do it now because it would cause too much of a stir, but at the end of our 4 years, we'll give you a pardon. But we don't know. We don't know what was said off tape because they only started the recording at one point.
And she was already only serving a 20-year sentence, and her previous facility was, not maximum security either. Um, what do you make of her trial and the charges against her and her ultimate conviction? Did that go far enough?
Yeah, I mean, they chose to prosecute only a few of the victims because they felt that those were the best cases to prosecute her for. But, look, the victims would like to see her ultimately be behind bars for the rest of her life.
Right.
So if you ask the victims, 20 years isn't enough. But, look, if you compare that to what Epstein got, at least she got 20 years. And she certainly should serve out the entirety of her sentence for what she did, because she's still unforgiving and unrepentant with respect to her crimes. If you ask her, even up until today, she still doesn't think that she did anything wrong.
And yesterday, the Supreme Court met to consider cases to take up during their next term, and one of them is Ghislaine Maxwell's appeal. What should we know about that? What do you think the likelihood is that the Supreme Court will take this up?
Well, I mean, if they do take this up and address the issues that are involved, the biggest issue is this deal that Acosta entered into. And she's utilizing that deal to be able to say that she had immunity for any of the subsequent acts that they prosecuted her for. And ultimately, that was found not to be the case by the trial judge in the case in New York, because the sweetheart deal dealt with victims in Florida. So in other words, if you victimize, 40 young girls and you enter into a plea deal for those 40 girls, that doesn't mean that you get a free pass with respect to other crimes you may have committed. And that's what she's trying to argue through her lawyers, is that this sweetheart deal not only gave Epstein immunity, but it also gave her immunity for anything that she may have done anywhere. And again, it just reminds us of what an awful, awful, awful deal this was that Acosta negotiated. He gave in this deal immunity to not only Epstein, but co-conspirators that they have never talked to, that they had never gotten anything from. It was awful, just atrocious, which is why they wanted it to be a secret. I had to move to compel this document back in the litigation back in 2007 and 2008 because they've refused to turn it over.
And you've pushed for the release of Epstein's black book, surveillance tapes, and phone logs. What do you believe those hidden records might finally confirm as survivors and the public, continue to push for answers?
Well, based upon the work that I've done on these cases, there are certain things I know that the records will show, and then certain things that I think they will show. The things that I know they will show, I can only speak about in general because of certain privileges that are involved. And I know that those documents will show numerous other high-profile individuals that were involved in some of these actions with Epstein. That includes corporate CEOs and other very high-profile famous individuals that were frequenting Epstein's mansions and were probably receiving massages by some of the girls that were there with Epstein. What I also think they will show is obviously videos of the inside of his mansions in the islands in New York and in Palm Beach, because the FBI raided the home in the islands, and that's where Epstein stored all of his digital material, thinking it was safe from the US government. For example, we know that when they instituted the search warrant on his home here in Palm Beach, he had gotten a heads up from somebody. And he had pulled all of his hard drives from his computers. And you can see that when you watch the videotape of the walkthrough by the police, there were Post-it notes that say, "Don't take this," which insinuates, take that, just not this. And we clearly know that there were CPU units from computers that were missing, entire computer hard drives that were missing, surveillance cameras, surveillance systems that were taken out. And we had information that he had taken them out and flown them over to his island to keep them safe there and away from police. So I know those videos are there. What's on them is really the key. Then we also hope that the FBI did their job, which I think they did, and prepared investigative memoranda with respect to everybody that was involved. And we want to see those. What are the memoranda? Because those are summaries of basically all the evidence that the FBI had. And that's going to be important for the world to see.
Senator Ron Wyden has been trying to push for more transparency of the financial records for Epstein and any ties that might reveal. What should we know on that front?
Well, I fully support, and so do the victims, that disclosure of financial information, because, again, Epstein was utilizing those finances to traffic women and girls. So whoever was part of that world in the financial industry had to know what he was doing if they ever went to one of his homes. If anyone from Chase Bank or any of the other banks that were, sued as a part of Epstein's conspiracies ever went to his home or ever talked to him about, the young girls that he would get and bring, they had to know that they were financing a sexual trafficker. And those ties are going to be important. Also, he loaned money to people and he gave money to people and paid for things for people. Why would he be paying for those things if he wasn't getting favors in return? And alternatively, the other goes the same way. He was getting money from people that they weren't investing with him. They were just giving him money. Why were they giving him money? Were they giving him money for girls? So those finances are going to be important at the end of the day so that we can run down those trails.
Congressman Thomas Massie says that he has the necessary votes for his petition to force the release of the Epstein files. But right now we're facing a situation where the federal government is on the brink of shutting down. When can we expect some sort of action on this?
Well, you'd have to talk to the Speaker of the House on that.
And he does not seem very enthusiastic.
No, he does not. No, he does not. And, it's obvious why he is delaying swearing in the new House representative that was elected in the special election, because he knows that her vote is going to break that release petition, and they're going to have to vote on it, whether they want to release this information or not, up or down. Give it an up or down vote. Either you stand behind the release of this information or you don't. And everyone's going to have to go on record. And listen, constituents are going to have to judge for themselves for candidates that choose to vote to keep a pedophile's information secret, or to vote for someone who wants to release documents so the public can see this information. Take it up or down, vote on it.
Releasing the Epstein files used to be a rallying cry for Republicans and for the president. And that is abruptly changed with Trump's second term, after he had that big show with some of his Department of Justice officials and claimed he had released everything, but he didn't. Talk to us a little bit on the political realm. I mean, the about face for Republicans, is it just as simple as the fact that suddenly Donald Trump does not want this information released?
Well, and I've spoken on this before on other news networks, including I was on Newsmax and Fox, and I've always said the same thing. This is not a political issue, right? This abuse of power and secreting of information has crossed every single platform and political party. It has been in place since Obama was president, Biden was president, Trump won. It doesn't matter. None of them have released this information.
Right.
But what's different is that Trump came out in the pre-election phase and said he was going to release it. He brought this back to the forefront of the public's knowledge, and the people stood behind him and rallied behind this issue and voted for him because of that, because they felt he was going to clean the swamp up in Washington, D.C. And part of that was going to be not to protect anyone and to release the information to the world at large. And everyone stood behind him. And now for him to completely reverse course on that can only mean one thing, that he didn't know what was in those records, and now he does, and he doesn't want them released. That's the only change. The only difference between Trump pre-election and Trump president is he now knows what's in those documents. And now he's changing his tune. So you got to let the public judge that and ultimately hold accountable those people that are deciding to about face on the promises that they've made.
Very few victims of sexual assault ever come forward, reported to the police. And whenever there are high-profile cases like with Jeffrey Epstein and justice is not served, I know in talking with people who work with victims of sexual assault who man the hotlines, they always see a spike in people who don't report because they see that they won't be believed, that they won't get justice. Can you talk with us about what people who have survived sexual assault, what you would like them to know about the fight for justice right now?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I would tell victims of sexual assault is it's not your fault. You had nothing to blame for what happened to you. And unfortunately, that is one of the biggest issues that we see in this area of law when it comes to victims is they blame themselves either for the situation they put themselves in or allowing this to happen to themselves. They start beating themselves up and feeling guilty. And as a result of that, they don't think anyone's going to believe them if they report this because they feel that the world at large is going to start just pointing fingers at them and blaming them for the situation that occurred. And then sadly, part of our population in the United States and around the world does that to victims. Mm-hmm. So they prove this unfortunate inner belief with victims true when they start blaming these victims for what occurred to them, which is not their fault in any shape or form, especially when dealing with minors. You know, the law protects minors because they have not fully developed into adults and have the ability to make conscious decisions, especially about things such as private sexual relationships. Mm-hmm. They're children. We don't allow them to make those decisions for a reason because they haven't developed yet. In addition to that, you have a power imbalance. You have a very powerful person and a 15-year-old. There is no ability of a 15-year-old to make those kind of conscious decisions. And as adults, we cannot think about what they should have done because we're adults. Mm-hmm. And we have adult brains and we have a consciousness as an adult and we have power and integrity as adults that we've developed over many years. They're still developing. They're crying over another girl that posted something mean about them on Snapchat, right? That's the level of emotional development of some of these young girls. So it is not their fault. That the system needs to take that and understand that they feel that way and make sure that they feel comfortable coming forward and frankly hire advocates, whether it's myself or others that can fight on their behalf in this justice system, both in the criminal as well as the civil system, so that they feel protected. and that they feel like they have an advocate behind them.
Have your clients faced threats and harassment in the course of the case?
They most certainly did back at the original stages of the case. So when the cases first came about back in 2006, 7, and 8, they were being followed by private investigators. Their trash was being dug through. Their parents were being harassed. They were getting harassed by private investigators on their job. One of my clients was working at a local restaurant here in Palm Beach, and investigators came into her establishment and sat at her section of the restaurant and wanted to talk to her about Jeffrey Epstein and wouldn't leave her alone, and then followed her in a black Tahoe back to her home. They during the discovery process, they went after Planned Parenthood records of these young girls. They were interviewing ex-boyfriends, asking about sex acts that these young girls had engaged in. They scoured their social media. It was an absolute onslaught against these poor girls back then when it occurred. And again, 16 years old, and you've got a team of the highest paid lawyers in the country, along with hundreds and thousands of dollars being spent on private investigators to investigate these 16-year-old girls. It was an enormous amount of pressure, enormous.
It sounds like there was just a tremendous cost to these, young women to come forward and tell the truth.
Sadly, there was. I'd like to think that once they retained counsel, we kind of quieted down some of that and were able to protect them from a good deal of that by going to the courts and getting orders put in place. But, again, that's why it's important that these girls get advocates that can fight for them as soon as possible, because the system won't help them. What a lot of these victims don't realize is that even when they go to police or the FBI and the police aren't working for them.
Right.
They're working for the state or the federal government. So they are not their advocates as victims. And if they, in other words, the federal government or the state police or the prosecutors want to do something, even if the victim disagrees with it, they can do it. That's why they need independent advocates to fight on their behalf that represent just them as victims at the earliest stage of these proceedings, because then there is somebody that's only looking out after their interests and helping them and advocate for them. That's what's so important.
And earlier this month, we saw that news survivors had stepped forward at a press conference in Washington, D.C. What kind of message do you want prosecutors and power brokers and enables to hear out of that press conference and their fight moving forward?
I think the most important thing is that if they don't disclose this information, I think the survivors will. Up until now, the survivors have been waiting for the federal government to do the right thing when it comes to disclosing the individuals that were involved in all of these activities. But I don't think that the survivors are going to wait much longer for the government to do the right thing. So I think that's what's important, number one. Number two, I want any sexual predator, I don't care how rich or famous they are, to know we're going to get you. And it may not be now, but we'll get you. And you're going to end up behind bars, or you're going to end up broke, because I'm going to take every single dollar from you.
What has inspired you personally to take on this fight?
Good question. I had someone very close to me a very long time ago that was the subject of sexual abuse and sexual assault as a child. So when the first victim came to my office back in 2007, it was very personal. And I was going after someone that I thought was a very bad person in Epstein. And it gave me an absolute pleasure to try to seek justice for people that have been victimized like that, because I had seen what happens when people like that are not held accountable, because it can absolutely torture the victims of that sexual trauma for the rest of their lives. This was somebody that had been abused as a child, and now she was in her 40s and still suffering the consequences of that sexual assault and trauma. So what I have found through the work that I've done over the last number of years is that if you address it head on early, that victims feel that there has been some measure of closure and justice. Even if the person's not convicted, just being someone that comes forward and tells their truth about what happened and speaks out, it's a huge weight off of the victim's mind, such that they can hopefully then get therapy and move on with their lives and not have it affect them negatively forever.
So it's an important part of their healing process.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Just telling their story is part of that healing process.
Yeah.
The more they tell their truth and tell their story, the better they ultimately feel in the long run.
Well, Spencer, I hope that if survivors do decide to come forward with some of these details, that you would come back and speak with us again, because these are stories that we need to hear. People need to be held accountable. And I appreciate you taking so much time to speak with us about this. Is there anything else that you would like to share with everyone before we go?
So first of all, my pleasure. And thank you for having me on. I do appreciate the opportunity. What I would say is that if someone has been a victim of sexual abuse or sexual trauma, it doesn't have to be Epstein. These things happen in family settings. They happen in settings with friends of family. They happen with other famous people, whether they be actors or athletes or professionals like veterinarians, doctors. I've had all different kinds of unfortunate cases where dealing with power and sexual assault and abuse occurs with minors. So just because you're not a victim of Jeffrey Epstein doesn't mean you're not a victim of someone else that may have, twisted things against you and done inappropriate things. And those people should just feel just as empowered to step forward and tell their truth.
Thank you. I so appreciate that. I hope that for anyone who is watching and does want to come forward, the RAIN hotline is there to help victims of sexual assault. That's a great resource. And we'll also post some other resources as well when we post this interview again. And thank you so much, Spencer. I cannot thank you enough.
Thanks for having me.